Welcome to Cyprus. First, let's do a brief history. Well, maybe that was too brief. Uh, let's look at the history in a little bit more detail. About 90 million years ago, Cyprus was at the bottom of the Tethys Sea, and the Tethys Sea eventually becomes the Mediterranean. The African plate was moving north, and it was running into the Anatolian plate. As a result of that, the African plate subducts. It goes underneath the Anatolian plate, and it creates a fold right where Cyprus is. That fold begins to buckle and it comes up above the ocean. That's important for a couple of different reasons. One of which is a large amount of metallic material found its way moving up above the sea and into the mountains of what Cyprus. Keep that in mind because we're coming back to it. At about 10,000 BC, people came to the island for the first time. Now, when they arrived, there were dwarf elephants here and pygmy hippopotamus. The dwarf elephants and pygmy hippopotamus were that small because there were no predators on the island. So when people arrived, there was a barbecue that lasted about 1,000 years. The end result was no more dwarf elephants and no more pygmy hippopotamus on Cyprus. Now, there are pygmy hippopotamus in other places, but there are no longer any dwarf elephants anywhere. The earliest confirmed kill site for dwarf elephants and pygmy hippopotamus is in the very south of the country, and this also indicates the earliest human habitation of the island. The earliest human activity appears to have been about 10,000 BC, and of course that's primarily indicated by the dwarf elephants and the pygmy hippopotamus out here on this particular peninsula of Cyprus. And the bones were located, of course, in a cave along this cliff. The elephants themselves were about the size of really big dogs, heavier of course, but not much taller. The elephants were much smaller than elephants that we have today, and if you're looking for elephants, you want to look for that molar. That molar will tell you whether or not you've got an elephant usually, because that molar usually exists for some time. And I was told that there was a kill site on the coast at Crenia. So I went to take a look at it. Now this kill site is not a protected site. It's right on the coast and it's eroding away. So it may not be here for much longer. But you can see that there's a pile of bones there. They're all sort of higgledy-piggledy, all piled up. It's a trash heap. That jaw does not appear to be a dwarf elephant, and I was told that there were some there. But it may be the jaw of a pygmy hippopotamus. Now take a look at the hippopotamus, and you'll see that its teeth doesn't look at all like the dwarf elephants. Instead, they look much more like pig's teeth or even human teeth. Incidentally, baby pygmy hippopotamus are extraordinarily cute. They're about the size of pigs. We know that the elephants and hippopotamus were killed by people because of the cut marks on the bones and because these bones have been burnt. We're in Limba, the experimental village. This village is very old, and it's a little bit north of Paphos. This village has some water wells, and these water wells are extremely old, maybe 10,000 years old. They may very well be the oldest water wells on Earth. Radiocarbon dating places the age of the well at about 8,000 BC. Now, this well is about 2.5 feet wide, and it goes down about 15 feet or so. There were some handholds dug into the side so that people could go up and down. And at the bottom of the shaft, there were some small natural channels in the bedrock through which water would have flown, confirming that this was, in fact, a water well. It was full of all kinds of debris that you would expect, but there was also the skeleton of a young lady there. No one knows when she got in there or why. This is the actual site of the village, and you can see that the village is not in terribly good condition, but it is probably dating from about 3,500 BC or possibly even earlier. The reconstruction is also on site, and the reconstruction gives you an idea of what the village actually did look like. Now, in this particular case, they're depicting the village as having flat roofs. That's not necessarily true, as we'll see when we go to some of the other villages. The interior tends to have a post in the middle, or in the alternative, it might have a fireplace in it. This larger one may not be an individual's home, or if it is, it's a pretty important individual because it is larger than usual. And it does have a clear fireplace in the middle of it. What's really important about this particular village is some of the artifacts that we found. These happen to be female figurines. The goddess, or a goddess of some kind, seems to have been extremely important here. Some of the Venuses have very odd-looking faces, and this one is no exception. It looks kind of like a bird face. This is not the only one that way. There is another one that apparently got a child with it. So it's one of the first Madonna and child figurines that we have. And many of the figurines look very much like they might be modern art. Like some modern art, they tend to be simplified and flat. This last Neolithic site was near Paphos, a little bit north along the coast. The next one is to the west of Limassol. And this one is much, much larger and potentially considerably older. In addition, this particular Neolithic site is 100% excavated. Estimates for the maximum population run as high as 2,000, an astounding figure for the time. Wheel-less pottery techniques were known only in the local culture's latter phases during the so-called aceramic period. The reconstruction shows the houses having flat roofs, but we happen to know that some of the buildings were in the shape of beehives, that is, tholoi. The inhabitants of this village buried the people that died underneath the houses that they used to live in. Sometimes there were as many as 28 skeletons underneath a house. Nearby, there are the remains of an 8-month-old cat, which was discovered buried with a human body at a separate Neolithic site in Cyprus. The graves estimated to be dated at 7500 BC, predating ancient Egyptian civilization and pushing back the earliest known feline-human association significantly.
The site behind me is called tenta, which means something very much like what you see, that is, a tent. In this case, more of a teepee. This is a Neolithic or very early Bronze Age site. There was copper production in the area here, and these are about the same age as the other Neolithic sites we've seen. But the way that it was discovered was very interesting. You see, back in the days of Constantine, the emperor's mother, Helena, was on her way to Jerusalem, and she was coming through this area, and her party was caught by a storm, and they had to put up tents at this area. And then on their way back from Jerusalem, they came back this same way. This time, Helena has a piece of the true cross with her. And she had noticed earlier that there was a shrine to Aphrodite at this location, and so she had a church built on this location instead, and she left a piece of the true cross at this shrine. Well, a few years ago, people tried to locate where she pitched her tents, and they started an archaeological operation here looking for evidence of St. Helena. They didn't find any evidence of St. Helena, but what they did find was this Neolithic site, and they found that immediately. It was very easy to find. There must have been lots of them on Cyprus.
I told you earlier that not all of the houses here in the Neolithic villages had flat roofs, although that's generally how they're depicted. The fact is that we have a pretty good idea that some of them were tholoi, that is, beehive-shaped. And the reason for that is because the walls of the houses tend to lean inward. This next item is a hide of copper. This is the period of time when copper is just coming into production. This is the edge of the difference between the Neolithic period and the Bronze Age. And copper was in production at the end of the period of time of these villages. It's called a hide because obviously it looks an awful lot like an animal hide. And this is the way copper was traded in very ancient times. The word for copper and the word for Cyprus are the same word. They come from the same place. You see, in ancient times, Cyprus was the source of copper for the ancient world. It was mined here very, very early. I'm reminded of a story. I had a dental hygienist some years ago, and I saw a picture that she had in her office, and I asked her where it was, and she said it was Cyprus. And I said, "Do you know what that means?" And she said no, and I said, "It means copper." Now the interesting thing is, the next visit that I had with her about 6 months later for my regular checkup, she told me a story. She was watching a TV show, one of those little game shows where they ask you questions, and she and her husband were there, and the announcer says, "What does the word Cyprus mean?" And she shouts out, "Copper." And her husband says, "How did you know that?" The galleries of the mines run for miles through these mountains. The timber is also extremely important. It's been estimated that for the extraction of copper alone, they would have needed 16 times the standing crop of forest that existed then in Cyprus for just the copper smelting. This means that the lumbered forest areas naturally regenerated many times in order to cope with this need alone. We're moving now to another part of the island, over at the Salamis Farmagusta area. Actually, we're not going to be visiting either one of them first, because the oldest site there is a town called Alasha, and I'll have quite a bit to say about Alasha. It was founded almost 4,000 years ago. Alasha was founded back maybe 1800 BC, 2000 BC, something like that. It rose to prominence when it became a large copper-producing center during the late Bronze Age. Akkadian cuneiform slabs found at Tel El Amarna in Egypt contain promises of copper to the pharaoh from the king of Alasha. in return for silver and luxury goods. It's still unclear whether the name Elisha referred to Cyprus as a whole or just to this particular village. What remains of the present site dates from about 1200 BC. The rectangular grid layout was established then, and its fine public buildings were erected. The city was known for its high standard of living and its wealthy merchants who conducted trade as agents of the Mycenaeans. A fire and at least 2 earthquakes led to the city's decline, and then its inland harbor silted up. Some speculate that the last residents headed to the coast and founded Salamis. Much of the site has been looted, but many of the tombs are said to have held gold, ivory, and exquisite Mycenaean pottery. Also found at this location was a tablet in Cypro-Minoan script, which has been undeciphered, and the famous horn god, possibly of representation of Apollo, whose worship was imported from Arcadia in the Peloponnese, and an exquisite silver bowl inlay with ox head and floral designs, whose only known equal came from Arcadia. There are about 150 graves spread out over the cemetery. It dates back to the 7th and 8th century BC, basically, and the burial chambers closely match descriptions of Mycenaean tombs in Homer's Iliad. Kings and nobles were buried there with their favorite worldly possessions, food, drink, and even some sacrificed slaves. Particularly gruesome reminders of this practice are the skeletons of 2 hapless horses, sacrificed after transporting one king to his tomb. A few of the terrified horses broke their own necks at that particular moment by lunging in their tackle, and at least some of the attendants didn't willingly follow their masters into death. They had to be bound hand and foot. Salamis was founded in about 1180 BC by Teucer, or Tukros, if you want to use the Greek. He was the son of Telamon, who was the king of Salamina on the Greek mainland, which is how Salamis got its name, basically. He was the brother to the Greek hero Ajax, and he was unable to return home from the Trojan War after failing to avenge his brother's death. Salamis later came under Assyrian rule, and the first recorded mention of it is on an Assyrian stele dated to 709 BC. The period around the time of the Trojan War and slightly earlier seems to have been a period of mass migration of Mycenaeans into Cyprus. In the 14th century BC, Mycenaean Greeks moved into the area now called Larnaca, but at the time it was called Crition. We're at Bronze Age Crition now. Actually, the original site was Bronze Age, but on top of that, there's a Phoenician site. The Bronze Age site is Mycenaean Greek. The Phoenician site occurred a couple of centuries later, and over on top of both of them is the city of Larnaca now. There's even a legend that 6,000 years ago, Kition was actually founded by Noah's grandson, Kitium. Just to the east of Limassol, there's a little ruins called Amathus. It's among the oldest of Cyprus's city kingdoms, founded by a son of Hercules. According to one version of the myth, Ariadne, fleeing the Cretan labyrinth, was abandoned here by Theseus. She then died in childbirth and was buried in a sacred grove. Stories about Noah's grandson, or Ariadne, the labyrinth, and Hercules suggest that these stories must be very, very old, pre-Trojan War. Just to the west of Limassol, there's another town called Kurion. It was occupied in early Neolithic times, but the Mycenaean Greeks came in the 12th and 13th centuries BC. Incidentally, the theater at Kurion has excellent acoustics.
Friends, Romans, and countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is often interred with their bones.
Agapenor was the leader of the Arcadian contingent to Troy, and he was said to be shipwrecked nearby Paphos in the 12th century BC, and he decided to stay. Now there's an interesting thing about that. We found artifacts that have a script on them that indicates that they came from Acadia. And that's Mycenaean Acadia, so that the myth is at least partially confirmed. Now another thing that comes out of the Trojan War is the source of copper on Cyprus. It's mentioned by Homer. Homer specifically mentions the copper mine at Temesi near Nicosia. In Homer's Odyssey, it says that the goddess Athena told Telemachus, who was Odysseus' son, that is Ulysses' son, to go to Tomassos, or Timnos is the way she pronounced it, with a load of iron, and to trade that iron for copper. Timnos is not very far from Nicosia. Today it's called Tomassos. But it does have a very large old copper mine. These sculptures came from the old archaeological site at Tomassos. But the fact is, what were the Mycenaean Greeks doing on Cyprus in the first place? Well, for one thing, we know that they were doing pottery, and we know that they were doing copper in industrial quantities. But why were they on Cyprus? Well, there are rumors that there might have been a drought. There's the possibility they were driven off the mainland by Dorian Greeks, and there were other possibilities as well. But in any event, at about the time of the Trojan War, or a little bit before then, Mycenaean Greeks were on the move all throughout the eastern Mediterranean, and they were colonizing Cyprus at a prodigious rate. By the 12th century BC, Mycenaean Greeks were in Kyrenia. Just a few centuries later, Cyprus came to the attention of the world. It was becoming a strategic location for strategic resources.
At a key maritime crossroads between Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, the island has always been a stepping stone for marauding armies.
In the 8th century, Phoenicians took over two of the cities that we've been talking about, Kition, which later becomes Larnaca, and Amathus. At this time, the Assyrians take over the island. The island is basically Mycenaean Greek, and it retains that culture to a large extent, but it looks much more to the east now than it ever did before. The Egyptians are periodically in control, and you can see that clearly in the artwork. And finally, the Persians are there in the 6th century. There are two major revolts by the Greek islanders against the Persians. Both are unsuccessful. This is a cylinder seal. It reminds us that the island was under the control of people from the Near East. A cylinder seal is a lot like a signet ring, except you run it across clay instead of punching it into wax to make your sign. The deities, too, become much more Middle Eastern, and especially Egyptian. Here we see two depictions of Bes. That's an Egyptian deity associated with childbirth. But he, in Greek legend, becomes Pan. The old goddess is eventually replaced by Astarte, a Near Eastern fertility goddess whose name means sea foam. Incidentally, those conical stones appear to also represent the fertility goddess, for reasons which I do not understand at all. That brings us to the most famous deity on Cyprus. It's Aphrodite, whose name, curiously enough, also means sea foam, and she probably is the successor to Astarte on the island. But this is her Greek name, and everyone in Greece knows that name, and this is where she was born, or at least that's the story on Cyprus. On Kithra, they say she was born there, but then on the other hand, she's a goddess, and perhaps she was born more than once. In fact, she wasn't born at all because she had no mother. Another curious thing is these rocks. They don't come from Cyprus either. They actually come from Africa.
We're at Aphrodite's Rock. This is where Aphrodite was supposed to have been born. That is where she came ashore. Aphrodite means sea foam. And that's interesting because we believe that her predecessor in the Near East was Astarte, which also means sea foam. They seem to be about the same sort of goddess. No one has seen Aphrodite in a long time, but according to the Baron von Munchausen, she made quite an entry.
Hello.
Incidentally, sea foam is also involved in the Little Mermaid. According to Hans Christian Andersen, mermaids, when they died, they became sea foam.
Curiously enough, the Disney version of The Little Mermaid does not discuss sea foam.
Ruga Savruga, come winds of the Caspian Sea. Now rings us glacitis, sec, max, laryngitis, la voce to me. Now sing. Keep singing!
Sea foam, apparently more important than you'd think.
Incidentally, if you swim around the rock 3 times, they say it will improve your love life.
This brings us to one of the most famous of the Aphrodite stories. This is the story of Pygmalion. Pygmalion was a sculptor on Cyprus that did work in ivory, and he did a statue of Aphrodite in ivory, and it was so lovely that he fell in love with it. And so he prayed to Aphrodite to have a girlfriend that was just like the statue. And when he got home, he kissed the statue, and it turned into a real woman. They had at least 1 or 2 children. This story, of course, is the basis for My Fair Lady and probably many other similar stories. In addition to My Fair Lady, this may also be the basis for the idea of the story for Pinocchio. Pygmalion, incidentally, is a Phoenician name, not Greek. Aphrodite's Rock wasn't the only place where Aphrodite was said to have been on the island at one time or another. After she had been entertaining her friends, she was said to go to the baths of Aphrodite, which are far to the west of the island, the far west end. These baths today are simply a very nice natural spring to visit. And Aphrodite, of course, wasn't the only deity that was important on the island in these times. Apollo was here as well. This is taken at Apollo of the Woods temple. Apparently there was a woods here at one time, but the woods is pretty much gone. Now, if you take a look at the capitals on that temple, though, those capitals don't look at Greek at all. They look like they may very well be Middle Eastern. This is the similar romantic tale of Pyramus and Thisbe, although this one doesn't have a happy ending. In this particular case, the young lady is wealthy and her parents don't want her to marry the young man that she loves. So they start meeting secretly, and the young man goes out to find her one day, and she was at this location, but she'd been afraid of a leopard that she had run across, or perhaps it was a lion. The stories are not entirely clear. In any event, she leaves a garment behind, and there is blood on the garment, and the young man finds the cat and the robe, and he is certain that his young lady has been killed by the lion or leopard, whichever it was. In any event, he can't live without her, and he kills himself. Of course, the young lady returns shortly thereafter as she discovers her dead lover, and she also commits suicide. This story is the basis for 2 of Shakespeare's plays. One is in the Midsummer Night's Dream, the other in Romeo and Juliet. Cyprus stayed under Middle Eastern influence really until the time of Alexander the Great, when he returned it to the Greek culture. And in effect, it stayed that way even though it was under the control of the Egyptian Ptolemies for some time. Coming from about the time of Alexander the Great, there is a shipwreck that has been recovered in Cypriot waters. It's up in a museum in Kyrenia in the north right now. This shipwreck occurred someplace around the coast, fairly close in actually, at about 300 BC. What you see here is a scale model of the shipwreck. The original ship was a wooden-hulled Greek merchant ship made out of Aleppo pine. A local diver found it in 1967, and we're moving now to the actual ship. This is what remains of it, in pretty good shape, really, considering how warm the waters were. It's being preserved essentially the same way that the Mary Rose is. One of the things that we know for sure is that the boat had been in service for about 80 years at the time that it sank. And it sank because of piracy, not because of its age. We know that it sank because of piracy because there were some tablets found with a curse on them. You see, in these days, the pirates thought that the curse would keep the ship at the bottom of the ocean. But apparently, the warranty on the curse ran out and the ship was discovered and raised. This is a reconstruction of how the hull would have looked with its cargo inside. The cargo included almonds, grain, wine, and they would have been in those amphora, those odd-shaped containers. Those containers are pointy like that, but they fit very nicely inside the hull of a ship. This has to do with the construction. And one of the things that I wanted to point out was that it used copper nails, and in addition to that, there are some portions of it that are put together with wooden pegs. The copper nails tend to be below, the wooden pegs above, and this part of the ship is actually sewn together. That's very much the way that an Egyptian ship would have been made. Based on some cargo, which would have included some millstones that they were probably also using in ballast, they have reconstructed what they think the last voyage of this ship looked like. It started out in Samos and made stops at Rhodes and then finally out to Cyprus. That's where the pirates hid it. The ship was plundered and there are even spear marks inside the hull. Imagine yourself surrounded by ancient tombs in a desert-like landscape where the only sounds that you hear are waves crashing on the rocks. That's the tomb of the kings. Actually, there aren't any kings buried here at all. It was simply an area where there were tombs of very wealthy people on Cyprus. The tombs were influenced by ancient Egyptian tradition, which believed that the tombs for the dead should resemble the houses for the living. It's a little bit north of Paphos, and it was put in place between the 3rd century BC to the 3rd century AD. The light at the end of the tunnel is still subsurface, but it's an open area so that you can see the sky from what is apparently intended to be a courtyard inside the tomb. There are 7 excavated tombs scattered over a wide area, but the most impressive one is number 3, which is the one that we're in. It's got this open atrium below ground level, surrounded by columns. Most of the other tombs just have niches built into the walls where the bodies were stored. Most of the tomb's treasures have long since been spirited away by grave robbers. Next we go to what has to be one of the most curious collections that I've seen in any museum at all. It's a collection of custom-made hot water bottles. That is, for each part of your body there is this clay container that you can pour hot water into that will cover any part of your body. I've never seen anything quite like it. This has got to be the ultimate in hot water bottles for ancient times. And this is the end of Cyprus BC.
Be careful, the steps are uneven. And here is very low. The wall is low, have to bend our head.
For our first stop at Cyprus AD, I'm going to reach back into BC. This place that we're at is actually the burial site of the 7 Maccabee brothers who were martyred around 174 BC during the time of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Their mother was Aya Soleimani, and that's the name of the place. She's a Jewish woman who became a saint. I don't know how a Jewish woman became a saint after the death of her sons. It was thought that the space was possibly a synagogue in Roman times. The point is that this Christian catacomb actually predates Christ, and that's very interesting all by itself. The practice appears to have been much older than simply Christianity. Another curious but related fact is that on Cyprus at least, very frequently Christian pilgrims, as well as Muslim and perhaps other religions as well, including Jewish in this particular case, tend to visit the same sacred sites. That is, if a site is sacred in one religion, frequently the other religions will honor it as well. Of course, that's not universally true. There is also a curious separate sacred well, which is accessed by a separate flight of stairs, with water so clear you can actually step in it unintentionally, even though you've been warned. There's also a potentially hazardous danger because there's a deep well at the bottom there. It's possible that this sacred site actually goes back before the time of the Maccabees. It could very well be a pagan shrine of some kind. We're going over to Salamis now on the east side of the island. As a matter of fact, Salamis has almost always been the #1 city in ancient times on the island of Cyprus on the east side. In Ptolemaic times, it was in fact the capital. And it's only less than 100 miles off of the coast of Syria, making it an easy trip for anyone during ancient times. You'll recall that Salamis became the #1 city after the time of Elisha, when Elisha went sort of bankrupt. It had been founded by the brother of Ajax, and it developed into the major city on this particular part of the island. And eventually it's destroyed for all practical purposes in the Arab raids of the 7th and 8th century. And it's eventually followed by Famagusta, which is just a little bit down the coast. But we're looking at the Roman period. And in the Roman period, Salamis is the #2 city, and Paphos is the capital. Salamis is to be the island's #1 archaeological site. This particular site is absolutely huge, and another city, of course, was not built upon it, and so the ruins are fairly easy to get to and fairly extensive. This is the gymnasium, followed by the baths. This part of the city still has a few mosaics and frescoes, but for the most part, they're gone. What it does have is indications of the central heating system, the hypocaust, which is that open area there supported by bricks. Hot air would flow through that and warm the floor. This area is a fish market, and it's only recently been excavated. And so this is fairly fresh. It's something that's still going on today in Salamis. And matter of fact, they found some Roman roads there that I'm going to be showing you in just a second that are brand new, that is just discovered last year. This, on the other hand, is something more mundane. It's a 44-seat latrine. This is the public latrine that would have been used during Roman times. Now, privacy is minimal in here, but apparently that wasn't of any particular importance. If you were really rich and you wanted to improve your position in life a little bit, you might have a slave sit on the marble and warm it up for you before you sat on it. Something else that's here is that there are an awful lot of water channels. Of course, there would be a lot of water necessary for the hot water baths and for the latrines. Now, every self-respecting Roman city, or Greek city for that matter, had a theater, and Salamis was no exception to that. As a matter of fact, it had both a Roman amphitheater and regular Greek theater. This is the Greek theater, and it holds roughly 15,000 people. This statue has been reinforced with iron, I think, and that iron is going to split that statue as the iron rusts. They used to make that mistake. I hope that they don't make it much longer. They should have used bronze or copper or something that wouldn't rust. Just beyond the theater, there's that fish market that I told you had just been excavated a couple of years ago. Look at the road that runs down the way between those pillars. If you extend that out, it heads off into the distance towards the harbor. And that's where the folks found the road. That's the Roman road last year. This road was almost certainly used by St. Paul. What you'll recall from your Sunday school lessons, of course, is that in Acts, Barnabas and St. Paul joined up for his first missionary work. What you may not recall, though, is that Barnabas is a boy from Cyprus. He used to own real estate on Cyprus, which he sold. In fact, he was from Salamis, and so that explains it. Their first objective was Salamis, then, on the island of Cyprus. From there, they walked along the southern coast until they got to Paphos. Now, a couple of things happened according to tradition, although you will not find this in the New Testament. At the city of Larnaca, for example, they ran into St. Lazarus.
We're in Larnaca, Cyprus. And behind me is the Church of St. Lazarus. You see, after Lazarus was resurrected, things apparently got hot for him in Bethany. And so as a result of that, he fled to Cyprus. And St. Paul and Barnabas made him the local bishop. He died the second time, of course, and he was buried here at this location. In the 9th century, they erected a church here. The original church dates back to the 9th century at least. And in about 900, the Byzantine emperor had him dug up and sent to Constantinople. He's in Marseille now. But the locals, of course, didn't want him to go, and they knew that the Byzantine emperor was going to take him away. And so the rumor is that they hid the body under the altar, and that the body is still there. Right behind me, there's a large salt pan that's just outside of Larnaca at the airport, or very close to the airport at least. And one day, when Lazarus was bishop of Cyprus, he passed by this way, and he was getting a little bit hungry and thirsty. And this area at that time was said to be a vineyard. And the lady that owned the vineyard was out picking grapes. And Lazarus saw her and her basket, and the basket had a cover on it, and he asked her if he could have something. And she said no. She said the basket, which in fact had her grapes in it, instead only had salt in it. And as a result of that, now this area has been cursed because Lazarus was refused food, and it's now just a big salt pan. There is something else about this area that's also very interesting, and it's right here, just off of the salt pan. I'm going to swing the camera around. Just behind me there's a mosque, and that mosque was built there for a particular reason. You see, back in the 600s, Cyprus was being subjected to a lot of raids by Arabs. And one of the Arab raiding groups happened to have the aunt of Muhammad. This is back in the 600s. And she must have been pretty old at the time, and in any case, she fell off her mount here at this location and died, and she's buried, and that's why they built that mosque at that location.
Well, back to St. Paul and Barnabas, making their trek over to Paphos. They passed through Kurion, according to tradition, and they dropped by that theater that I showed you earlier. And they heard a lot of noise in the theater, and so St. Paul thought, well, this would be a good time to go preach. So he and Barnabas went into the theater to see what they could do. They took a look, and they turned around stunned. Everyone in the theater was naked, and St. Paul, for one time in his life, could say nothing. We're moving on with St. Paul and Barnabas to the capital in Paphos, on the west side of the island. Incidentally, that bell ringing is for an actual church service. It's Sunday, and that's an Episcopal service being held in the church. This isn't just for tourists gawking at the inside. This church is where it is, and we are here because this is where St. Paul's pillar is located. This is where St. Paul was said to have been scourged on Cyprus. Except he wasn't. The whole thing is really a story. Nevertheless, it's an important part of the tradition on Cyprus. According to the New Testament, St. Paul was beaten by the Jews many times, and occasionally by Roman officials, but he was apparently never scourged. Scourged means to interrogate with lashes. It's a technical Roman term. And in Roman times, it was believed that no one was going to tell the truth unless they were tortured. Therefore, the scourging. There was a maximum of 39 lashes that could be given. After that, it was considered cruel and unusual punishment. After his experience in Cyprus, Paul did return to Jerusalem, and there he very nearly was scourged. As a matter of fact, there was a scuffle and trouble between him and the Jews, and a Roman centurion came out with some troops to try to find out what was going on, and he was going to scourge Paul in order to question him. However, as Paul was being bound, the centurion that was in charge of the small body of men leaned over, and Paul whispered to him, is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty? This caused him some concern. The centurion, who incidentally is the equivalent of an American major, lieutenant colonel, perhaps even a captain, reported to his tribune, who is the equivalent of an American colonel. You see, since the days of Caesar Augustus, it was illegal under the Lex Julia to either bind or beat a Roman citizen. So Paul's statement caused a little bit of concern. To wrongly claim Roman citizenship was a serious offense, so people wouldn't do it lightly. Certainly not Paul, but he might have had a small document with him called a diplomata, which would have been carried in a small pouch around his neck, and that could have proved Roman citizenship. We don't know if that was the case, however. In any event, Paul was believed, and the tribune comes back with the statement, I had to pay a big price for my citizenship. He was referring to the bribes that he had to pay in order to get his citizenship. But Paul responded, I was born a citizen. The tribune was concerned because he had already put Paul in chains. Incidentally, the tribune's name was Claudius Lycus, and that suggests that he had gotten his citizenship quite recently under the reign of Emperor Claudius, and he had taken that particular name as his own first name. The bottom line, of course, is that St. Paul is unlikely to have been scourged on Cyprus or anywhere else for that matter. Despite the Apocrypha that we've run into, something very important did happen to St. Paul and Barnabas at Paphos.
This is Paphos. Generally speaking, the place that we're at, generally called the House of Theseus because of the mosaics. This was usually the place of the Roman governor. Proconsul was the term that they used. Sergius Paulus was a proconsul of Rome. Remember that name. We'll come back to it.
But it's not the governor's palace that is the most splendid in town. No, the most splendid in town is the house of Dionysus, which is a little bit north of the house of Theseus, the governor's palace. It's at that location that the best mosaics on Cyprus are to be found. Certainly the most extensive. In these days, if you wanted to do a floor covering of some kind, you'd almost certainly do a mosaic. That is, you'd have little bits of stone cemented into the floor in a pattern. These patterns were universal throughout the empire. You could find them anywhere. Any of these patterns might find their opposite number in North Africa or Gaul or Great Britain or anywhere, because the same workman would have done the work. You see, any time there was a situation where lots of money was being made, these specialists would flood into that area and make sure that they were able to create all the mosaics that the local demand created. And the local demand created lots of them. They will go on floor after floor in the same house. Each picture has its own quality standard based on the size of the pebbles. The smaller the pebbles, the more of them you can get into a small space. And the result is a sharper picture. Here we're looking at some of the best megapixels of the period. Colored stones. No home is complete without them. Incidentally, Cicero was governor of Cyprus for a while. Actually, technically, he was proconsul. That's the term that the Romans would have used. And he just loved the job. It was really a cushy job, and he came home with lots of souvenirs. There was never any fighting on Cyprus. The Romans never had to post an army there. It was very quiet and tranquil, and everyone was reasonably happy and prosperous. When Lucius Sergius Paulus was proconsul of Cyprus under Claudius, that's the 1st century A.D., here in Paphos, Paul and Barnabas and John Mark came in contact with him. According to the book of Acts, when they got to Paphos, they found a certain magician, a Jewish false prophet whose name was Bar-Jesus, who was with the proconsul Sergius Paulus, a man of intelligence. This man summoned Barnabas and Saul, also known as Paul, and sought to hear the word of God. But Elymaeus, the magician, for that was the way his name was translated, was opposing them, seeking to turn the proconsul away from the faith. But Saul, who was also known as Paul, filled with the Holy Spirit, fixed his gaze upon him, and said, "Now behold, the hand of the Lord is upon you, and you will be blind and not see the sun for some time." And immediately a mist and a darkness fell upon him, and he went about seeking those who could lead him by the hand. At this point, the proconsul saw the light, so to speak, and he became the first Christian convert that was coming out of the Roman ruling classes. So, is this story true? Now, the Roman writer, Pliny the Elder, does make reference to a Sergius Paulus, who he used as a source along with others in Book 2 and 18 of his work on natural history. And it's also interesting to note that Pliny mentions that the island of Cyprus was overrun with people who practiced sorcery, just like Elymaeus, who the Bible says was trying to deceive Sergius Paulus. Pliny writes, quote, there exist different groups of magicians from the time of Moses, such as Jannes and Lotapi, of whom the Jews have spoken of, and in fact many thousands yearly follow after Zoroastrian ways, especially during recent times on the island of Cyprus. But of course, that Sergius Paulus may not have been the proconsul that appears in the book of Acts. There was a boundary stone of Claudius mentioning Sergius discovered at Rome in 1887, and it records his appointment in AD 47 of the curators of the banks and the channel of the river Tiber. And in 1877, 10 years earlier, near Paphos, there was a memorial stone found indicating that Sergius Paulus was the proconsul at that time. In Paul's epistle to the Romans, he does not greet Sergius Paulus, and it is possible that Sergius Paulus had died before it was written.
We are at the tomb of St. Barnabas. Barnabas was a boy that was born in Salamis on Cyprus, and he owned real estate there. And he sold that real estate and he turned it over to the church. And then he joined up with St. Paul for his first missionary trip. And that first missionary trip was back to Cyprus, where they landed at Salamis, his hometown. Barnabas stayed pretty much on Cyprus, whereas St. Paul went on for other missionary travel. Barnabas was eventually martyred here. He was killed by the Jews, stoned to death, and he was buried here somewhere. Then, several hundred years later, someone had a dream. And in that dream, they dreamed where Barnabas was buried. And the emperor in Constantinople was very interested. He sent out a team to verify that, and they found a body. And that body had a moldy copy of St. Matthew in his hand. And as a result of that, they concluded that this was, in fact, his burial place. Now, of course, whether it was or not is open to some conjecture. This location was destroyed by the Arabs in the 600s during their raids. They eventually rebuilt this area.
You can go down in the crypt and visit St. Barnabas if you like. It's just a short walk down. Now let's take a closer look at that story that we just heard. You remember they validated the fact that this was St. Barnabas because he had a copy of St. Matthew in his hand. Well, there's a problem with that. You see, the Gospel of St. Matthew was not written until St. Barnabas had been martyred already. That leads us to the inescapable conclusion that St. Barnabas must have had an advanced copy. Things went along swimmingly in Cyprus up until about the 7th or 8th century, when there were a series of very, very difficult, very powerful Arab raids along the coast. Most of the cities were devastated. In fact, Salamis was practically completely destroyed and had to be replaced by a new city Famagusta, which was just a little bit to the south. But the point is, Cyprus was in big trouble because it was largely undefended. The Byzantines realized that, and initially their response had to be naval. The Arab navies had to be crushed in order to protect Cyprus and, for that matter, Byzantium. And the Byzantine answer was Greek fire. Greek fire destroyed the Arab navies to a fairly large extent, and the armies were reorganized along modernized lines. And the most important thing, for as far as Cyprus is concerned, is that the fortifications were vastly upgraded. In addition, the capital was moved inland to Nicosia, where it still is today. Back in those days, in the earliest Byzantine days, the fortifications of Nicosia were rudimentary, basically just a blockhouse with fortifications. But curtain walls came up pretty quickly around the cities. After beating back the Arabs, the Turks turned on Byzantium, and Byzantium found itself short of everything except the enemy. The year is 1095, and the Turks have put their capital on the European side of the Bosphorus, only 100 miles away from the Byzantine capital, Constantinople. The emperor at that time is Alexis, and he writes a letter to the Pope asking for some military help. He expected that the Pope would behave like a Byzantine official and organize the recruitment of a few hundred professional soldiers. This was a mistake, and that letter had profound consequences which Alexis could not possibly have imagined at the time that he wrote that letter to the Pope. The First Crusade turned out to be remarkably effective. It did liberate Jerusalem and a substantial portion of the Middle East leading up to Jerusalem. And the result was that the Latin knights founded various kingdoms and counties and such, and set up an order that looked very much like things did in Europe. The result is that you have a prince of Antioch, a count of Edessa, a count of Tripoli, and there's a king of Jerusalem now. This lasted for some time, but eventually the Arab forces found their ground, and they started a counterattack. The Crusader army was destroyed, and Jerusalem was lost. But not all of the Crusader kingdoms or counties fell into Arab hands. A second crusade was called to liberate Jerusalem, but this was largely a failure, and that led to the call for the Third Crusade. This one was substantially different from any crusade that had gone before, because unlike before, this time the crusade was led and financed by kings. The King of France, the King of England, and the Holy Roman Emperor were all involved. And the most important one, the one that we see the most of, is King Richard. He makes the Third Crusade what we think of today as the Crusades. That big block of stone behind me is Limassol Castle, and it's been rebuilt several times. So it's not the story. But there is a great story about what happened here. You see, the Third Crusade kicked off, and Richard's army was headed for Jerusalem. And they went mostly by ship. And unlike most of the people that were crusaders, of course, Richard brought a substantial portion of his family with him, his mother, sister, and his fiancée. And they were separated in a storm, and the fiancée was shipwrecked on Cyprus.
The person who was in charge of Cyprus, his name was Komnenos, which is the imperial family name, and he called himself the Byzantine emperor in Cyprus. But when the fiancée requested help, he did not provide it. That was a big mistake. Richard landed with his army, and he taught the emperor of Cyprus the error of his ways by defeating him several different times and taking possession of the entire island. This is the only location where there is a English royal wedding outside of England. Richard was married to Beringa, his fiancée, here at Limassol Castle.
You can't really tell what this is very well from the photograph, but all you can see is a shadow of the camera. But it's the latrine inside the castle. This was excavated recently and analyzed, and they discovered substantial and even surprising amounts and varieties of intestinal parasites in the soil. Apparently, the Crusaders were very uncomfortable. So in the year 1191, during the Third Crusade, Richard I of England, that is Richard the Lionheart, captures the island from Isaac Komnenos of Cyprus. Now, Richard had intended to use the island as a major supply base because it was relatively safe from the Saracens. But then a year later, Richard sold the island to the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar is one of two organizations which we're going to have to talk about a little bit because they tend to get a little bit confused. The Knights Templar were a professional body of soldiers that were directly responsible to the Pope, and they were established in the temple at Jerusalem, and that's why they're called Templars. There was another organization called the Knights of St. John's, or the Hospitallers, who were also set up as professional knights directly under the Pope in Jerusalem, but at the hospital in Jerusalem. These knights did not always cooperate 100%, although normally you could count on them. In their day, they were effectively the Delta Force and SEAL Team 6 of the Crusader Kingdom. The way you can tell the difference between the two of them is that the Knights Templar tend to dress in white with red crosses on them, and the Knights of St. John in darker clothes with white crosses on them.
This is Colossae Castle behind me. It's near Limassol. The thing that's important about it is that it was where the Knights of St. John set up their headquarters. Now, the Knights of St. John are sometimes called the Hospitallers, and the reason was because in Jerusalem they occupied the hospital. When they were forced out of the Middle East, they fell back to Cyprus, to this location. From here, they fell back to Rhodes, and they became the Knights of Rhodes. And then from Rhodes, they fell back to Malta and became the Knights of Malta. Today, this is basically a vineyard.
Almost immediately, the Knights Templar were faced with a bloody revolt, and deciding that holding on to the island was not economic, they sold it to Guy Louis IX. Now, Guy Louis IX was king of Jerusalem, but he had lost his kingdom, so he was in search of a new one. And this made a perfect marriage. He became both the king of Jerusalem and the king of Cyprus. They held the island for a couple of hundred years. Then the last Louis IX king died in 1473, leaving the island to his Venetian widow, Queen Catherine Cornwall. In any event, the island is turned over to Venice for administration, and eventually Venice incorporates it into its empire entirely. During these Latin years and the later years of the Byzantine period, the fortifications on the island grew dramatically in order to ward off various kinds of Arab or Muslim raids. Let's go to Nicosia, the capital. You remember it started out just having a watchtower. Well, that pretty quickly becomes a castle, and then a castle surrounded by curtain walls during the Louis IX period. But during the Venetian period, the fortifications really hit their stride because cannons were big. And Venice brought in Star Wars technology, that is, the Star Fort, which was the latest thing in defending cities from cannons. Even today, from the air, you can clearly make out the Star Fort in Nicosia. Now this is the cathedral in Nicosia. This is the place where the king of Cyprus would have been crowned as he took his position. And from here he would go down to Famagusta and be crowned king of Jerusalem as well. It's today not a cathedral, it is a mosque. And this area is prone to earthquakes, and so they've got some glass embedded in the walls there that will break if the blocks start moving apart. The fort at Kyrenia Castle, retains its Louis IX appearance for the most part, although it has been reinforced by the Venetians to a considerable degree. Nevertheless, it's the Louis IX period that is most important to the stories concerning Kyrenia Castle. This castle was never taken, and it's in excellent condition. The Turks convinced the garrison to surrender by catapulting the heads of the Venetian commanders of Nicosia over the wall.
We're in Kyrenia Castle, and in Kyrenia Castle, one of the most interesting stories is about the king's mistress, Joanna.
The standard tour of the castle includes the torture chamber, and this is where one of the really good stories of Cyprus come in. It's during the Louis IX period. King Peter I de Louis IX had a mistress. Her name was Joanna la Allemande, Joanna the German. And King Peter was out of town, and the queen was in charge of the castle, Queen Eleanor. And Queen Eleanor had the mistress tortured. Now, Queen Eleanor wasn't torturing the mistress really because she wanted to hurt her quite so much as she wanted Joanna to abort. But Joanna did not abort the baby even under torture. She gave birth to a son, and her son became king eventually because King Peter had no other heirs. In the mountains overlooking Kyrenia Castle, there are a series of castles. It's probably started out just as watchtowers built by the Byzantines in order to signal back and forth. And they're still close enough that they could signal back and forth, but they each have their own strengths. One of the ones that is most interesting is St. Hilarion, named after a Christian hermit that was up on this mountain at one time. The castle is substantially built into the mountain and incorporating the mountain in its structure to an incredible extent. As a matter of fact, there is still a Turkish army post at this location. Although it was built over a period of centuries, and much of it is Latin in its architecture, the primary walls were built mostly during the late Byzantine times, as you can see from the red on this plan of the fort. Another rumor that's extremely interesting is that Walt Disney was aware of this particular castle, and he patterned the original designs of Snow White's castle after the Saint Hilarion. This is a drawing, one of the early drawings that Disney was using. The most outstanding piece is a little tower at the very peak of the mountain called Prince John's Tower. It's called that after Prince John of Antioch, who was visiting his relatives here at St. Hilarion when the Queen told him that his guards, which were from Bulgaria, were plotting against him. Prince John took the guards up to the tower and threw them over the side. Of course, the guards weren't plotting against him. The Queen was. Our guide here was a Turkish Cypriot who, as a young man, had actually been in the military posted at this particular castle. And so he was familiar with it from several different angles. One of which was he knew where the barracks were. He knew where he would be imprisoned if he went AWOL, and he did go AWOL. He got very homesick from time to time. And when he got into trouble, he could tell you what kind of punishments would be meted out, and how people were treated, and how they felt about the place. Venice was spending so much money building up the fortifications of Cyprus because on Cyprus, Venice was making money hand over fist. Venice was a mercantile empire, and it was doing business primarily with the Mideast. The Pope, however, had said that no Christian should do business with a Muslim. As a result, almost everybody had to funnel things through middlemen in Cyprus. And the middlemen in Cyprus, the merchants in Cyprus, became extremely wealthy. The result, of course, was that Venice poured huge amounts of money into the fortifications on Cyprus. As we've seen, the Star Fort on Nicosia and the Kyrenia fortifications were magnificent. But they were almost nothing compared with the walls at Famagusta on the coast, the main trading point. This became the last point in Cyprus to be taken by the Turks. And incidentally, this particular portion of the sea fortifications is called Othello's Tower. Othello is a fictional character of Shakespeare. Shakespeare set Othello at Famagusta because of its fabulous wealth and its reputation for disreputable actions. That made it an ideal exotic location for the play. And this is the famous Lion of Famagusta. The lion, of course, is the symbol for the city of Venice. But once a year, it is said that the lion at some unexpected time will open his mouth. And when he does, you can reach your hand in and pull out the wealth of Famagusta. Incidentally, there was a second class of citizens in Famagusta that were nearly as wealthy as the merchants, and that was the prostitutes. There are famous stories about them. One of the stories is that one of the ladies dropped a pearl at a party into her wine glass and dissolved it and drank it just to show off her wealth.
The Battle of Famagusta was a horrific battle. It lasted a very long time, much longer than anybody thought, because the Muslims had overwhelming superiority. They had 150 long-range cannons, much larger caliber than the Venetians. They may have fired as many as 100,000 cannonballs. The streets are littered with them still today. The Venetians had about 90 cannons, and they returned fire, of course. And the battle went on for a long time, as I said. When it was over, the Venetians did surrender. And they went to the commander of the Muslim forces. The Muslims were surprised that there were so few Venetians to begin with, and they were in very bad shape. And everyone felt a great deal of sympathy for them. The Venetian commander was a very striking person, a very good commander. The Muslim commander was mediocre at best. His name was Lala Mustafa Pasha. And Lala Mustafa Pasha was moved to sympathy. But something happened, and he changed his mind. Perhaps he remembered how many Muslims were killed in that siege. In any event, despite the fact that the Venetians had negotiated a settlement in which all the civilians were to be let free, and the troops were to be allowed free escort out of the area, he started reneging on his promises. Lala Mustafa Pasha had the Venetian commander's lieutenants executed in front of him, and the Venetian commander fared much worse. He was executed by being flayed alive in front of the church. And his skin then was stuffed with straw, and he was put on a cow, and he was paraded around town with his banner. Lala Mustafa Pasha is now the name of the mosque which had been the cathedral.
This is Lala Mustafa Pasha Mosque. It had been the cathedral in Famagusta, the place where the kings of Jerusalem were crowned. The king of Cyprus would be crowned first in Nicosia and then go to Famagusta to be crowned king of Jerusalem as well. It's a ruin, of course, and this is one of the cannonballs that litters the streets still today. They're stone cannonballs, of course. That's what they used at the time. At one time, Famagusta had 365 churches. You could go to a different one every day of the year. Today, those churches are almost entirely in ruins. Of course, the Ottomans brought in far more of the Near East culture onto Cyprus than it had before. This happens to be a five-star caravansary, that is a hotel, a first-class hotel. This one right now is used primarily as a tourist mecca, and they have this particular caravansary filled with various tourist souvenirs and things like that for sale, handicrafts and so forth. But this would have been the first-class place to stay for an Ottoman merchant. These rooms are wonderful in many different ways. One of the ways that you can tell that it's a five-star location is because each of the rooms has a fireplace, as indicated by that chimney above each one of the little rooms. And incidentally, at this caravansary, there was something going on that I often run into. There was a professional film crew in there, a TV crew for as far as I can tell, for some kind of local TV, that was interviewing people. I often run into professional photographers, and I like to see what it is that they're taking pictures of. Now, the Ottomans were never as invested in Cyprus as the Venetians had been, and they lost interest in it. And in 1859, they transferred the island to the British. The British held it until 1960. They relinquished it as independent because there had been a guerrilla movement on the island amongst the Greek Cypriots, and frankly, the island was becoming too expensive to maintain. As the revolution progressed, the revolutionaries were attacking not only British interests and British soldiers, but also Turkish Cypriots. They terrorized them. And the result was that the Turkish Cypriots organized themselves into militias, and they returned the favor to the Greek Cypriots. There was a civil war in the making. Now, with the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots going at it at each other, hammer and tong, the British, who were kind of caught in the middle, decided to divide the island up into Turkish and Greek influenced sectors. This was done by a British officer who used a map and a green ink pen, and so the line between the north and the south is referred to as the Green Line. This continued until 74. At that point, the Greek Cypriots attempted to join all of Cyprus to Greece. Turkey then invaded the northern half of the island and restored the Green Line in order to be able to protect Turkish Cypriots.
The United Nations set up a buffer zone between the two sides. Known as the Green Line, it's now a permanent divide across the whole island. To the south, the Republic of Cyprus is Greek Cypriot. It's part of the European Union and is recognized internationally. To the north is the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. The divisions that have torn Cyprus apart go right to the heart of the island's capital. The Green Line runs through Nicosia.
The result is that Nicosia is the last remaining divided capital city on the planet. However, on the bright side, cooperation between the North and the South has increased since about 2003. I believe that there have probably been cats on Cyprus ever since there have been people, perhaps even before. But in any event, I ran across a description of a local legend that I wanted to read to you because it was obviously written by a non-native English-speaking person. So listen if you would. According to local legend, in ancient times of drought in Limassol, divorced lot of vipers. Local residents began to leave Cyprus in search of suitable accommodation. On hearing this, St. Helen decided to help the people. The decision was original. She brought to the island in 1,000 cats that, in the absence of other food, vividly dealt with reptiles. Currently, the area of Limassol is the monastery of St. Nicholas, which is popularly called a feline. Here, there are many cats that are fed by tourists. Well, in fact, tourists and locals both feed cats everywhere. And I can't imagine anyone ever bringing cats into Cyprus. Bringing cats into Cyprus would be like bringing coals into Newcastle. There just doesn't seem to be any point in it. There are a couple of nationalities that traditionally vacation in Cyprus. Greeks like to come here because the island mostly speaks Greek, and so that's understandable. The Brits like to come here because it used to be a British colony. There are British forces still on the island, and most people do speak English, so that's understandable. The third group are Russians. Now, the Russians haven't traditionally been on Cyprus. However, they are now, and the reason that they're on Cyprus is a very interesting one. They generally tend to use Cyprus to launder Russian mafia money. That's what it's most famous for. So, when the EU had a problem with the deposits in Cyprus in the banking system, the thing that they went after really was the Russian mafia by taxing the deposits of large holders. Do you remember this story that I told you about my dental hygienist in the first hour? You remember Cyprus means copper, and she mentioned that during a game show that was on TV, and her husband said, "How did you know that?" Well, it turns out that she had been on the island with her husband, and her husband was Russian. That's how he knew about the glories of Cyprus, apparently. So I asked her what her husband did for a living, but she didn't seem to know. Isn't that curious?
Papa,